Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar in this series on Demand Control Schema. And I'm Amy Kroll, and I just want to do some housekeeping items before I turn it over to Robyn. First of all, as you can see, we have our interpreters on the screen. In order to see them best, either pick Fine Color or Fine Gray from the drop-down menu on that window. There's also a captioning occurring, and you can open up that window by going to the toolbar and selecting the closed captioning icon. If you have any technical issues throughout this webinar, please use the chat function, and we have members from the National Clearinghouse ready to assist you guys. Also use the chat function to ask questions of the presenter. You can ask questions at any time, and I will just be gathering those questions for Robyn, and then at the appropriate time they will get asked. I will be asking Robyn the questions, and she'll be responding. That will just streamline our process a little bit. I know many of you guys were looking forward to seeing Robyn, but we've had some issues with streaming the interpreters, and we wanted to get that worked out because we felt that was very important before we tried to make our system more complex. So that's all the housekeeping items. I have a couple more after this session is done today, but I just want to turn it over to Robyn and let you all know that she is coming to us from Scotland today. So Robyn, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Hello, everybody from Edinburgh, Scotland, where just about an hour ago I actually did hear a bagpipe playing just out my window. So I thought that was quite interesting. I thought I'd share that with you. It doesn't happen all the time. That's not what people all do here in Scotland, but I thought that was kind of interesting. In this session, we're going to be putting together all the various skills that we've been talking about at the webinar and also working on in the listserv. For those of you who've not seen the videos from past sessions or have been a part of them live, this third session may seem a little confusing if you haven't been up to speed, but I encourage you, if you have not seen the first two, to take a look at those, and hopefully the information we talk about here will fit nicely into place. We're going to be using both the PowerPoint that you see in front of you as a visual, as well as the packet that Amy sent out to you earlier of different examples. So I'll be toggling back and forth between the PowerPoint as well as the packet. Before we jump into this third session, I want to make sure that we remind everybody where we've been. In the first presentation back in May, I did an overview of all that DCS sort of encompasses. And in the second presentation, which was a follow-up really to the listserv's activities, we talked a little bit about some of the practical skills about how to identify and articulate demands and controls. And we also started teaching a set of new skills, which was the demand constellations and values. In this third session, what we're going to be doing is, in essence, putting it all together and, of course, asking the question, so what? That is, what's the point of all this? What is its usefulness, etc. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, in the first presentation, I designed it in a way, if you recall, where I asked us to embrace certain conceptual frames, and as a result of embracing those conceptual frames, we would have to abandon others. The first couple of things I asked us to embrace was this idea that interpreting is best understood as a practice profession. And I asked us to embrace the idea that jobs could be understood as interactive and dynamic. That is, that they involved demands, that which the job is asking of you, and controls, that which you as the interpreter bring to bear in response to the demands of the job. In other words, having this interactive view is a much more strategic and empowering view than it is to perceive work as happening to you. And I wanted to emphasize in the first session, as I did as well, I think in the second session, that this is meant to be a taxonomy. It's meant to help us organize our thoughts and be on the same page about what we're talking about so that we can have constructive conversations. I also asked in the first presentation that we embrace the understanding of what it means to be professionally responsible, which is really a conversation about values. And what would that mean? It would mean that we would have to be responsible for effective execution of professional values, which is actually quite a complex thing, because professional values is not a list of do's and don'ts. Professional values are a more fluid approach to understanding contextual factors and then regulating and compelling behaviors based on those values. Of course, the behaviors may very well look different context to context, but the values behind them are still the same. And that was a very different conversation to have. I mean, certainly context-based decision-making is not a terribly unique conversation to have in the field, but how do we understand the values that, in essence, create an ethical bookend to context-based decision-making? One of the problems with context-based decision-making is that it can be dismissed or criticized as what we call ethical relativism in the ethics world. Ethical relativism, where in essence you can justify any behavior by pointing to something in the context. But we don't want to be accused of that in an ethical way. We want to make sure we bookend is the best word I can think of, or best analogy I can come up with, bookend the other side of that contextually based decision-making with an understanding of sanctioned values. So we talked about that theoretically, and also we practiced that on the listserv, which was a complex thing for us because it's a new conversation to have. And of course, in the first presentation, throughout this idea of abandoning and embracing and the challenges it presents, I suggested constructs based in DCS that would help us in that process of embracing and abandoning. And then, of course, we followed up those proposed constructs on the listserv with practicing what does it mean to identify and articulate demands and controls. What does it mean to understand and articulate consequences as they relate to values? And how do we understand professional responsibility in this idea of
Hi everybody, this is Amy. It seems like we lost Robyn momentarily, but I'm sure she'll be back.
I'm right here, actually, Amy.
Oh, okay. Great.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Robyn.
I don't know why that happened. So in essence, what we've done is put these things, these ideas all together now in this construct of a decision-making tool, which we refer to as DCCRD, which is, of course, demands, controls, consequences, and resulting demands. So now we move into the topic of, so what? Why do we need decision-making models? Or why do we need taxonomies in general? As I mentioned earlier, taxonomies help us organize our thoughts and they help us manipulate our thoughts in ways that are standardized so that we can have constructive conversations. Unfortunately, all practice professions recognize that ethical codes cannot accomplish ethical decision-making for us. Oftentimes, ethical codes present for practice professions values that will likely come in conflict with one another. And when values of the profession come in conflict with one another, and I believe I've already mentioned this in the first and second presentation, when values come into conflict with one another, you need to have a way of thinking through decisions where you can, in essence, prioritize one demand over another and be able to justify that. What I'd like you to do now is take a look at the very first quote in your packet. It's a quote from Pope and Vasquez from the field of psychology. It says that ethics codes cannot do our questioning, thinking, feeling, and responding for us. Such codes can never be a substitute for the active process by which the individual therapist or counselor struggles with the sometimes bewildering, always unique constellations of questions, responsibilities, contexts, and competing demands of helping another person. Ethics must be practical, and ethics that are out of touch with the practical realities of clinical work, with the diversity and constantly changing nature of the therapeutic venture, are useless. Now, of course, this comes from psychology, but the piece that is very applicable to us is the recognition that a code of ethics or a code of professional conduct can only do so much. They can give us a list of our values, but in the end, we have to struggle with, because of the constantly bewildering, changing constellation of questions, responsibilities, etc., because of that reality, we have to have a decision-making model that will help us through that process. So that's an answer to the question, partly, so what? What else in answer to the question, so what? Let's go back to this analogy of a bookend. If context-based decision-making is one bookend, and values, let me say that again. If the context is one bookend, and the values is the other bookend, then we have a way of both compelling and regulating interpreters' behaviors. Similarly, think of the bookend of interpreting as a practice profession. I would also like to suggest that if we claim interpreting as a practice profession, and therefore has more in common with teachers, lawyers, physicians, social workers, then quite frankly it does with the people who do what we do but in a booth very far away removed from the social dynamics of a conference. If we have more in common with the practice professions, then the other ethical bookend that has to be put into place is the institution of reflective practices. That is the willingness and the rigor to think about and talk about your work with your colleagues. We have used the term in the past, as I did briefly talk about it last time, of supervision and case conferencing. I'm still here. I'm just changing something. 1 second, please. If a person has been able to spend enough time in reflective practice, listening to their colleagues, and having the values of the profession operationalized in the decisions that get made amongst their colleagues, then that decision-making process and the operationalization, I can't say that word, of values becomes an internalized process. And then supervision leads to self-supervision. So in supervision, it's the job of the facilitator or the supervisor to help people to internalize this decision-making process for themselves so that when they're out there working, in essence, they're being supervised by their own continuous process, by that idea that has the voices in their head that has been instilled by the other colleagues within their groups. The one that we've been studying in the webinar, the decision-making process, is the DCCRD process. And so we've been trying to break down this DCCRD process to get people to understand it well enough so that they can internalize it and then help other people internalize it as well. In the first session, I believe, I talked a little bit about reflective practices and said that all practice professions utilize them. There are different names associated with reflective practices, but they can all be distilled down to talking about your work with the company of others, with your peers, for the purposes of improvement, which of course is an ethical construct. The idea that you would, in the company of your peers, share your ideas, hear feedback, so that you can begin to diffuse the responsibility of the decision-making amongst the group, not just yourself. And also in the session that I talked about this, I mentioned this quote from Coakley, who in essence is suggesting this very thing, though in his article he doesn't particularly talk about supervision or reflective practice directly. But in essence, this quote really is compelling the profession to consider this as an ethical mandate. He says, the choices that we make and the actions that follow from those choices can uphold or deny the dignity of other people, can advocate or violate the rights of other people, can affirm or disavow the humanity of other people. Given the potential consequences of our choices and the resultant actions, it's reasonable to expect that we constantly re-examine those values, principles, and beliefs that underscore and shape the decisions we make and the actions that we undertake. And again, the only way we can do that in a sound, ethical way is within the company of our peers. So, the so what of this decision-making model, DCCRD, is so that we empower people with a decision-making tool, fully aware that a list of rules of do's and don'ts are not going to help them in their decision-making process within the varying context and amongst the varying different people that they work with. And the other so what is that this process, this decision-making process that they walk out to work with, has to first be instilled in them through a process of reflective practice, so that they reflect on practice and then they reflect in practice. From here on out, we're going to be using the packet, the PDF packet that has examples in combination with the PowerPoint. I'm also going to stop at points to take some questions during this. I'm going to be using case examples, and these case examples have been chosen because I'm trying to illustrate the specific DCS skill, some part of the DCCRD process. We are not processing cases. I know that by sharing cases can be a little bit provocative because people will want to say, well, I don't know why they did that, or I have an idea of what else they could have done, but we're not actually processing the case. We're merely looking at the case to see if we can figure out what skill set is needed or required as a result of that case. So if you have questions as I'm going through these examples, go ahead and type them in, because I will stop when I get done with looking at demands and controls and the examples associated with those to see if there are any questions about, again, how DCS, the skill set that we're talking about, is understood through that case. So I'll pause for questions and answer them before we move on to the next skill set, which will be building demand constellations. First of all, these cases that you have in front of you are coming from all over the U.S. I did not want to choose a set of cases that was only Rochester-based because I didn't want them to be identified. The interpreters have given their permission for use. And as you may see from your packet, some of the details of the cases have been blocked out to protect the details as they are in print. But I will actually say out loud so you can follow along what the content is that has been blacked out. So I will be supplying the details here. All right, so if you look at the packet in front of you, it's number 1, identifying and articulating demands. And first, let me say how I get these cases. I get them through supervision, but I usually ask people when I want them to present a case, I ask them to bring a case that they still think about. I ask them to give me a case where a decision was made, where they still ponder the decision and wonder about whether or not it was the right thing to do. I ask people not to bring cases that are extremes, because extremes don't make good examples. Certainly, we can all be empathetic about some of the more extreme situations, but they're not terribly helpful for supervision. And so the first example is going to be an example about how people have a hard time merely presenting a case. This first example is showing that interpreters really don't know how to talk about their work in constructive and even confidential ways, mostly because no one has ever taught us how. Actually, sometimes the benefit in supervision is merely just reframing and structuring the case. Talking about it any further sometimes isn't necessary, because what was really convoluted or complex or something they were still thinking about was because they didn't actually have it well understood and well framed in front of them. And the example that you have in your packet, where I have a before and after. So I asked this deaf interpreter, I was leading a deaf interpreter supervision group, I asked this deaf interpreter to please tell me about the case. And so he went up to the board and he wrote out what you see in front of you, which is, it was a case about where is the key for the safe box that the patient wanted to tell to certain people, but didn't want others involved. Some of the family had physical and verbal fights over the key issue. Also, the patient had breathing problems when it came to emotional issues. So when he got done writing, I said, is that it? And he said, yeah, that's it. But what you see after is what myself and the group was really able to pull from him when we said, actually, if you could just take us step by step, if we had been there, what would we have seen unfolding in front of us? And I want to go through this case and show you the complexity of the case that actually gets revealed. You can just look at it by the sheer the fact that it takes up the entire second page, or the second page and then on to the third page. That once a person has the chance to unpack the case, so many more details comes out. Now, the case you're seeing in front of you is the case that was structured at the end. It was not this linear. It was obviously not this detailed. All right, and we're continuing. So this was a hospital inpatient room. The patient was a hearing man in his 50s who was paralyzed from the neck down because of a car accident that happened about 3 days prior. He could not use his voice because he was intubated and he was on a breathing machine. He could only move his lips and his eyeballs. The patient is of normal intelligence, and he did not have any cognitive dysfunction due to the accident. The family meeting was to designate who was to get possession of the key to the safety deposit box and where that key was hidden. The family in the room included the patient's mother, the wife, the son, the brother, and the sister. Others in the room included a lawyer, a life insurance agent, and a nurse who monitored the machines. There were also security guards for the hospital standing outside the door in case there was trouble in the room. The deaf interpreter, known here as DI, deaf interpreter, was called to work with a hearing interpreter known as HI to read the lips of the paralyzed hearing man. And he was going to relay the message. The deaf interpreter was going to relay the message in sign language, word for word, what he was lip reading, to the hearing interpreter, who would then voice it into spoken English. The lawyer met with the interpreters and the family members in the hallway outside of the patient's room to discuss the rules of communication, which were: the patient, who's the paralyzed hearing man, would designate who takes possession of the key and where the key can be found. The deaf interpreter would read his lips and relay word for word what was said into sign language. The deaf patient would then use his eyes to communicate yes or no to confirm the accuracy of the message. The lawyer and the hearing interpreter and the insurance agent stood at the head of the head of the bed of the patient on the left side. The deaf interpreter sat on the right side of the patient at his midsection. The nurse was also near the head of the bed. The family members stood in a semicircle at the foot of the bed. The patient said that his mother should get possession of the key. The brother walked over to the mother and yelled, "No." The son walked over to the brother and they started quarreling and then physically fighting. The nurse called for the security guards and everybody calmed down. The whole family started arguing. The patient could hear all of this and see them becoming physically aggressive. The hearing interpreter would say to the deaf interpreter, now the deaf interpreter had his back to the family, she would tell him what was happening in the room. For example, the brother just punched so-and-so in the eye. Each time the hearing interpreter would comment on the events of the room, the deaf interpreter would turn around to see what was happening behind him. The patient would say without facial expression, "Joe, fuck you." The deaf interpreter would sign word for word, and the hearing interpreter would voice using first person. The brother and the other members of the family would come up to the deaf interpreter and tell him that he was a liar. The lawyer would have to yell at the family members to keep them from yelling at the deaf interpreter and each other. The patient would confirm what he said each time, and the lawyer was there to confirm the eye movements for yes and no. The deaf interpreter felt comfortable with his work, since what he read was continually confirmed by the patient. After about 45 minutes of this, by which the location of the key was never revealed, the lawyer ordered everybody out of the room, including the interpreters. At that point, the interpreters left and agreed they needed to calm down, but they never debriefed with each other. The deaf interpreter was never called back after that. Again, you can see just from a significant difference between the before and the after and how much more details came after this. Interesting, the deaf interpreter who presented this case said that the reason why he wanted to present this case, what was bothering him the most about this was he was mad at himself because he kept turning around to see what was happening behind him, which of course in supervision we were able to affirm for him that being careful of your own safety seems like a good idea. But that was the reason why he wanted to process it for lots of reasons, but that was the thing that really stuck with him. See how much more data here is available to us and how many different opportunities there are to talk about decisions that was made and quite frankly even just the learning about a potential kind of job an interpreter could be called in to do, which is actually interesting because I was also a hearing interpreter in a similar job many years back. And so it's important that the other people in the room recognize that this is a kind of job that they could even be called into. Okay, I'm going to go on. If you have questions about this case or how this is an example of sort of the differences between how people think about their work or what's on their mind versus what the process can bring them to through having them use the demand categories and having the people in the room pull out information, then please go ahead and ask your questions. Otherwise, I'm going to move on, and then I'm going to pause for questions at the end of this next example. In the next example, we have Scale 2 problems. If you remember the demand control schema rubric, we call the Scale 2 distinctness of demands. And one of the things that we try to get interpreters away from is the use of strong emotional and judgment language because it doesn't provide us with any information. It only provides us with the interpretation of the events. It doesn't actually provide us with the information. I actually gave this example in the last session when I was talking about how to build constellation of demands. But now I'm actually going to use it to show you actually quite a lengthy case. It has it's a lengthy case. It has a lot of words, but there's not a lot of information. What you instead have is the interpreters. I'm going to pause here. Is everything okay technologically after that last kickoff? I assume it's because I'm overseas. Yeah, I don't see the video as well. I'm going to hang on.
This is Amy. We are working on the video. It will just be a couple of minutes. Robyn, I don't know if you want to wait or if you want to continue, but the interpreters will come back up as soon as I can get them.
Amy just said that the interpreters, the video just to be clear, we're trying to fix the video. So for the interpreters, if everybody would just stand by. Actually, since If we still have captioning, I'm just going to ask people to go ahead and read the case to themselves, please, under example number 2, while we're waiting for the video to come back up. I also have written that in the chat function. All right, it appears we're all back and up and running. Thanks for your patience. So in that example 2, the only thing that is blocked out is something quite simple. The first blocking out of that case is using specific names of bridges. And the second blacking out, the full sentence says, "Lucky for me, the deaf client was very patient and understood that the phone was crackling in a challenge." It's interesting, I didn't have to black out much of this case because there's not much information really about the case. As you can see, her experience is really being processed through her own intrapersonal demands, which is very common because usually people bring a case that stirred up for them a lot of emotions. But even still, even when cases stir up a lot of emotions for you, we have to learn how to be able to report or talk about them in a way that still gives us details. And so this is a good example of a case where we would have to process it to try to help this interpreter get a handle on what she was dealing with, what were the actual demands. Obviously, on top of what was actually happening in the context was her own internal stuff. The third example I'm actually not going to spend time on. It's actually taken from a new book chapter that Bob Pollard and I have out called Beyond Interesting, which the PDF of that can be made available to you. For those of you who were in our second session of the listserv discussion, I sent this article out already. But if you're interested in following up to find out the example of the blasé clinician, I would be happy to send you that PDF, and I think Amy also has a copy of the PDF. So if you emailed Amy, she could send you that copy. Interestingly enough, and I'm going to stop after this to double check on questions, when it comes to identifying and articulating controls, interpreters are pretty good at that. That doesn't actually take a lot of work from me as the facilitator or the supervisor, with the following exceptions. First of all, interpreters usually know what they did because it's observable, and they're mostly able to talk about and identify what they did. Perhaps the only thing they might need help with when it comes to that is getting very specific. So if they say, well, I talked to the teacher, I might have to intervene at some point and say, well, what did you talk to the teacher about? What did you say? What was the conversation? In order to get the control spelled out in a very specific way. But mostly, my focus usually ends up having to be on showing them in the case where there was an opportunity to do something, but they did nothing. Because if you remember, when you do something or do nothing, we still call that a control decision. But people are not likely to voluntarily say, and so I did nothing, as they're presenting the case. They likely just go through, and only time that they did something will they articulate that. So my focus in classrooms and supervision sessions is to highlight opportunities where somebody could have done something but chose not to. And again, that choice might have been perfectly fine, but that needs to be articulated. Also, what doesn't come out terribly naturally are what I refer to and has written down here in your packet under pre-assignment controls. Controls are not only actions, but characteristics of the interpreter as well. And so I like to make sure that people understand that they bring something, or if they, on the flip side of that, perhaps don't bring something to a situation that's really sort of outside of the technical skill aspect. It might be a personal characteristic, patience, energy and excitement, bubbly personality, whatever. I might have to point those things out. I also like to point out when somebody has a positive working relationship or a established rapport with the deaf person or the hearing person. That's also an important control to recognize, because that person may well be able to behave in a certain situation that another interpreter might not be able to do because of that quality of that relationship. Or somebody might be more likely to behave or employ a control because of the expectation of the consumers. So those are examples, both demands and controls, articulating and identifying demands and controls in a real-life situation, even though we've been doing them in rather artificial situations. And, of course, there are many, many more examples of this, but hopefully these highlighted how that plays out in sort of real life. I'm going to pause. If there aren't any burning questions, because of our sort of 5-minute delay, I'd like to be able to go. But if somebody has a question about how those cases are examples of the demands and the skill set, please speak up now. All right, and seeing nothing, I'm going to go ahead and move on to some examples of what it means to build demand constellations. Some cases benefit only from an examination of one control decision. I would not say the deaf interpreter case, even though that was the decision he wanted, or the situation he wanted to talk about regarding his desire to look behind him so he didn't get physically hurt. But the case that we just went through, the case of the interpreter working in a situation over a teleconference where she was unable to hear and unable to understand what people were talking about, that actually is an example that I used last time of a demand constellation. It's interesting to me that in that case, the thing that this interpreter says at the very end of the case is actually quite a significant, what we will call a concurrent demand. She says, at the very end, if you're looking back on in your packet under example number 2, it's literally the last sentence. She says, "What helped in some ways was the deaf client prefaced me with, 'I have to be here. The boss is forcing me. I don't really want to be here,'" which is actually quite a big deal. And the fact that it comes at the end of the case, I think, is very interesting, but also, of course, very telling about her decision making, because really, the demand constellation I would want to emphasize with her is that that should have been a continuous concurrent demand with any main demand that presented itself. The fact that this deaf professional is disinclined or not wanting to be there, well, that's a motivation issue and a investment issue, and therefore the interpreter should consider that as an important piece of making her decisions. So that's actually a unique way to build a demand constellation. Usually the way we build a demand constellation is the main demand becomes evident to us, and then we flesh out the concurrent demands. In this case, actually it's the opposite. The concurrent demand is pretty significant, and really any main demand that emerged should have been coupled with that. But let's take a look at the second example, and I'll go ahead and read this along. This is an employee training. It was early in the morning. It's been going on for a couple of days. This interpreter was 6 months at her current full-time job. The teamer working with her sat in the way back, could be seen, but it was not terribly intimate communication between her and her teamer. She had a good relationship with her teamer, good rapport. There were 2 deaf people, one early and one deaf person arrived late. It was an icebreaker which started before the second deaf person arrived. It's that icebreaker that uses toilet paper, where you're supposed to pull out as many squares as you think you will need. That's what you're told. And then you have to say something about yourself for every square that you pulled out. So on purpose, the instructions are kept vague. So you will either pull off one little square or you will pull off 25. And then, of course, the people who pulled off 25 find out they've got to say something about themselves, 25 things about themselves. Perhaps you're familiar with this one. So the first deaf person pulls off 4. The second deaf person arrives, and the interpreter tells the second deaf person what's the plan behind the task. So she kind of gives it away. Likely she's got a relationship with this person. The deaf person is going to be last in the horseshoe when it comes to saying things about herself. The hearing people are saying various things. Some of them are off the wall. Some of them are not off the wall. One of the women, hearing women in the group, admitted to having gastric bypass surgery. It comes to the deaf person, the one who arrived late, and she says in ASL, "I'm worried about my dog. I sent her to get spayed this morning." But the interpreter misses the finger-spelled word dog and voices, I'm thinking about getting my tubes tied. At the same time, the interpreter is thinking, I can't believe she's saying this in front of these people. The hearing people all respond to this young deaf woman with, no, 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 you shouldn't do that. You are so young. The deaf person picks up on the response and the comments of the hearing people and asks the interpreter, what did you say? And then the interpreter voices out loud, there may be a problem with communication here, and then tells the deaf person what she said. The teamer at this point jumps in and says, I thought she said it was her dog. And then, of course, the deaf person joined in and she says, no, no, it's my dog. The interpreter then says, sorry, the interpreter has not had her coffee yet. She said that she's not getting her tubes tied, but that her dog is getting spayed this morning. The room explodes in laughter. The teacher who is leading this training and who the interpreter knows very well because she has interpreted for her before says, can we please get a new interpreter in a joking way? And the interpreter agrees. Yes, can we? The laughter dies down, and there are 2 more squares of toilet paper, and the deaf person says very basic things about herself. The second deaf person says no big deal things as well. The group moves on from there. There are no incidents the rest of the day. Interestingly, she adds, I didn't see that deaf person again until I was interpreting for her while she was stepping down from a job. And the interpreter double-checked before voicing, I'm stepping down from my position. So here she decides that she's not going to assume she was right, and she's going to ask the question. This interpreter had been there every day of the training at this point with a different teamer. She talked with the deaf person at the lunch break and apologized for the mistake, and the deaf person replied with, it happens, it's just fine. So the interpreter made the decision in this point that this case really sort of pulls out for us this one control, this decision to go ahead and say what you think you saw. The important concurrent demands in this case that need to be identified are that this is an icebreaker, that other people have shared private information. The hearing woman before her said gastric bypass surgery, correct? That there are differing cultural values on information sharing between deaf people and hearing people. Right? There are things that are taboo in hearing culture that may not be taboo in deaf culture. And there has been a developed relationship or a rapport over the 2 days. As a result, this interpreter was valuing letting a deaf person say what she thinks this deaf person wants to say without judgment, without checking, without potentially putting it back and saying, are you sure you want to say this? She decides to, go with it. So that's a good example of a case where a demand constellation really has to be fleshed out because the things that I mentioned are not identified in the case. Icebreaker is identified, but the fact that these are cultural values that are true about deaf people versus hearing people, that there's been this developed relationship, that it is an icebreaker and lighthearted. All of those things are important to recognize. The reason why we do this is that interpreters can easily tell you what they did, but they don't always know why they did it. And that can be true, the way Malcolm Gladwell talks about it, from a personal level, that we can make decisions personally and not really know why we've made them. And Donald Schoen, in his book, The Reflective Practitioner, talks about how professionally people make decisions all the time without really knowing why they've done them. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions about, again, the real-life application of these skill sets that we've been learning and talking about and how they play out. Okay, Amy, can I just ask a quick question? I'm under the impression that I'm going to be speaking, and I'm not going to be able to do the math, but for another, I'm not going to say it would be 10:15 my time, but that would be about 20 minutes from now. Is that true, that I should be stopping in about 20 minutes for questions and follow-up?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so the next topic that we are going to give examples of is away from structure and into analysis. What we've done up until this point really is, yes, analysis to some degree. I mean, there's really kind of a blurry line between structuring and analysis. But mostly what we're doing is just scaffolding by using this construct, demands and controls and demand constellations. Using those constructs, we're merely just structuring what happened, what did happen. Now becomes the opportunity for analysis of what did happen, but also the suggestion of other things that could have happened, or other realities about the case that now become hypothetical, now become open for discussion, opportunities for this person to think about other things, etc. Not that, again, they have not been thinking about things up until this point. This process of structuring should still not be dismissed as unimportant. It's actually quite helpful usually to people, and sometimes, as I've said, we only do this basic piece of the case and end there, because that's really the most helpful part of the process. The next section on your packet is called number 4, Consequences and Values. And this has been, for the listserv people who've been with me, a real challenge. And I have appreciated the perseverance of the people who stayed with me through this process, because the discussion of consequences and their associated values is not an easy conversation to have, because I would suggest, and having been doing recently for my PhD work, literature studies of not only sign language interpreting literature, but spoken language interpreting literature, and values is not something we talk about, or value-based decision-making is not something we talk about directly. I think there's lots of things that are values that we talk about indirectly that we can assume or interpret as values. But it's not a direct part of the constructs that we use when we talk about ethics. And so it's been a bit of a struggle. So hopefully these examples will highlight for you, yes, the direct application, but hopefully further define what we mean by consequences and what are the implied values of consequences. First of all, as you might know, in the DCCRD process, we talk about positive and negative consequences. What you have in front of you is actually an excerpt from our textbook, which is going to be, I'm actually sending it to the graphic designer tomorrow. I'm having separation anxiety. It's been done for about 2 weeks, but I can't send it off. This is taken from our textbook, and I'm not going to read it out loud because you could read it to yourself. I'm just going to summarize what it says. We don't mean, when we say positive and negative consequences, we don't mean something good happened by positive and something bad happened by negative. really the construct of resulting demand is the construct that gets used for what happened next. Consequences is a very different way of talking about positive and negative consequences, talking about values. When the interpreter made that decision, what was she going for? What was the intended effect? And the negative is what's a natural forfeiture of that? And again, I know I've gone through this before, but I'm going through it again because it's a tricky concept, and I think it takes practice to understand it. So let's go back and take a look at the decision the interpreter made to go ahead and voice what she saw that deaf person sign about getting her tubes tied versus having her dog spayed. What she was going for was fluid, uninterrupted communication, okay, which is a value of ours. It's not as if she necessarily thought the person that she had a mistake. She didn't necessarily think, oh, I've misseen this. She thought she understood it just fine. She just couldn't believe the deaf person was saying it out loud. So that really was where her mind was stopping her. It wasn't, oh, maybe I made a mistake. It wasn't an issue of accuracy. She was actually what she was going for was fluid communication, uninterrupted communication. Okay, letting people interact as they naturally would. What was forfeited was this potential comfort with the taboo subject that was being put out there. All right, let's look at some examples. And if we want to, we can return to the tubes tied example if people want to, because that actually has some. When you look at the other control decision, which she then later employed in another job with this deaf woman, of actually checking with her and saying, "Are you sure you want to say this?" Yes, what they're going for is accuracy, but what they're forfeiting is, again, this opportunity for this person to say what they want to say without somebody being suspicious of it or double checking it or whatever you want to call it, having it put back in your face as, did you say this? Has a place of judgment to it. And so that's a really interesting conversation, even though my initial reaction is to say, oh my gosh, you'd always check. But then I think to myself, no, I guess when you check, you can't avoid negative consequences in interpreting decisions. All right, if you move on to the next page in your packet, where it says, my pages actually might be a little bit different because I added some things to yours. But it says here, from a technical perspective focus of interpreting, here's what we know about values. Now, the list of values you see under there are not just from the RID, but they're actually a compilation of lots of different interpreting-related organizations, spoken and sign language, distilled down to some of the more common overlapping values. And those are accuracy, neutrality, fidelity or truthfulness, confidentiality, and then these last two, which are sort of flimsy, if you ask me, respect for consumers, and I believe we in RID also talk about colleagues, respect for consumers and colleagues, and then professionalism, which of course is again, I think those two categories, what respect looks like and what professionalism looks like is obviously being left up for interpretation. Now, one of the ways, I think, in the first presentation that I asked us to think about this conduit role or this valuation of invisibility that we've sort of had in the profession for centuries, really, if you look at spoken language interpreting, this idea of the interpreter's not really there, or the interpreter as a conduit, has stayed with us for a very long time. And many of us, if you look at the literature, there's a lot of arguments against this mentality, and yet it's something that still is quite pervasive. And in the first presentation, I suggested that we actually look at invisibility in different ways, that we actually distill it to its value level, that really what invisibility or the conduit role, and I'm using those terms interchangeably, is getting at is this idea of autonomy, agency, self-determinacy, and what I'll call laissez-faire. Now let me describe those. And again, because I've already done this in the first session, I don't want to spend too much time on this. But the idea of autonomy, agency, and self-determinacy are these ideas that this person is another person separate from me and has the ability to make the decisions about their life that they choose to make. Lots of practice professions have this kind of value. All right, in the medical profession, you can leave against medical advice. You have the right to make a decision about your own health care. Okay, so that's not a strange thing out there. And now I want to use this term laissez-faire because, and that's used in business, as you might be familiar with, this idea of let people be, let the markets be, don't interfere, right, this lack of interference. And so I'm going to use this idea of laissez-faire to flesh out invisibility in a values-based way. Okay, so if we could then, we could add autonomy, agency, self-determinacy, and laissez-faire to the list that's right above it, because I think that that's a fair distillation of the values that seem to emerge in our profession. Now, what would it mean to actually add to our technical understanding of interpreting, which is what I think we've been doing so far? What would it mean to add a practice profession focus? Most codes of ethics in the practice professions, actually I'm saying most because I haven't looked at all of them, but my assumption is that most, if not all, have a value of what they call non-maleficence, which is just the same thing as saying do no harm. But not just do no harm, but a value of benevolence, which is do good things, right? Do good. And so while we actually have do no harm in our preamble, which I don't understand why we have it in our preamble, why we just wouldn't put it in the Code of Ethics or the Code of Professional Conduct, I don't know, but I think that that would be an interesting thing. So in essence, when I work with people, on their cases, I see these set of values as what we can work with. What is evident out there in decision making? So as I mentioned, as we started to operationalize these values in decision making, it was a very challenging listserv, and I want to thank all those people who stayed with me on it and who allowed me to use examples that are here in your here in your packet from their homework, because this is again a hard thing to do. So what I'm going to do is give you examples from the listserv, from the different homework, and we're going to go back to the pig dissection. One of the benefits of sticking with one case or one picture analysis is that you really get to know it and understand it, and you come up with really good things after you spend a lot of time with it. So even though people think, oh gosh, not the pig again, it's actually beneficial to keep returning to the same case because it becomes more complex, even though it's hypothetical. It becomes more complex as people begin to add on to the very real nature of what this very hypothetical case sets forth. All right, so in this example, the demand is that a group member says, well, if you remember the pig dissection, is you've got a deaf kid who's the leader of the dissection, and the hearing kids in the small group working together are there to advise him in his process. And so the main demand is the group member says, I don't think that's right in relation to what the deaf student is doing. And the control decision of the interpreter is to say, do you want me to interrupt and tell him? Okay? Now, again, what are the positive consequences? What is the interpreter going for? Now, listen to these. You'll notice that these are not positive consequences like necessarily good things happened. They're merely getting at what the interpreter was likely going for and the values that were being preserved as a result. At the first bullet point, the deaf student is allowed, and remember we're defining allowed as an opportunity. The deaf student has the opportunity to focus on his current work. okay, which is really that value of laissez-faire. Let people do what they're choosing to do in the given moment. The interpreter makes the hearing student aware that his comment may be relayed to the deaf student. Right, so the interpreter is in essence respecting the consumer, making sure they understand. If you say this, it's going to be relayed, right, so that reminder, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Since the hearing group moving on to the third bullet point, since the hearing group member may not have intended for the deaf student to hear his comment, the interpreter has given the hearing group member a chance to keep his intention. Isn't that nice? I like this is again somebody else's work. Nice work. The next bullet point says the hearing students are reminded that it's possible for the deaf student to be aware of every comment they make. Okay, that goes back to respect and professionalism as well. Okay? Again, I actually think respect and professionalism have to be better defined for us, but regardless, there they are. Now, what are the negative consequences? Again, what was forfeited? What value of ours was deprioritized as a result of that decision? The interpreter calls attention to her presence and her impact on communication. The deaf student is not given full access to all comments made around him in real time. Okay, remember, we're not saying she's not going to tell him what she said. It's just not happening in real time, so that has to be made clear. A precedent for the rules of the interpreter engagement has been established. Okay, so education or people may think, oh, I can always talk in front of the interpreter and she won't always relay stuff. So in essence, a negative precedent has been established which goes against our traditional rules of engagement. And the natural flow has been interrupted. Okay, hopefully you're able to see how the positive and negative consequences are being stated as a intimation, as a discussion or a pointing to this issue of values. Let's look at another example. Demand. The deaf student looks up from the specimen and says, where's the teacher? The interpreter points to where the teacher is the control decision. Okay, what are the positive consequences? What is the interpreter going for? The deaf student gets the information he desires immediately. Okay? Other positive consequences. The hearing students aren't interrupted. Okay? Negative consequence. The natural engagement between hearing and deaf students is intercepted and diverted to the interpreter. Okay? And again, what you should be hearing from these positive and negative consequences, and there may be more, I'm just pulling out examples for our use here. Then you could actually maybe come up with more positive consequences or more negative consequences. But again, the negative consequences and positive consequences aren't necessarily that's reason to do it, that's reason not to do it. It's more an idea of what values are we prioritizing in a given moment, because values are always going to come into conflict with one another. That's pretty much par for the course for a practice profession. Let's look at this other example. Demand. The teacher walks up to the interpreter and says, how's it going? And the interpreter smiles, interprets the question, and gestures to the group to respond. What are the positive consequences? The interpreter gives the students a chance to answer the teacher's query and get the help they need. Okay? And the negative consequences, the interpreter does not get the chance to remind the teacher about directing questions to the students. Okay? I'm actually hearing another value here, which is education of consumers, which you could call that respect for consumers, or you can call it professionalism, but I think education of consumers is something we do pretty frequently, and I would suggest that we be more evident as that as a value. And then the negative consequences are, continuing on to the second bullet point, the teacher's inquiry to the interpreter is unaddressed, and the teacher's attempt to engage the interpreter is deferred. Okay? Now notice nobody is saying anything like the interpreter or the teacher gets mad at the interpreter, or the teacher says, why didn't you answer my question? If those were to happen, which I doubt they would, but even if those were to happen, those would be called resulting demands. Okay, they would not be called consequences, because consequences, again, are merely to try to frame for us an issue of prioritization or deprioritization of incommensurable values, values that come into conflict with one another. In light of our time, I'm going to go quickly through the last few examples. The concurrent demands are listed for you, but I'm going to skip reading those. You can certainly read them on your own, and I'm going to move to the positive and negative consequences, and then talk about what the implied values are. And then I'll pause to see if there's any questions, because this is, again, the trickiest piece of trying to get people's decision-making brains to this place. Okay? All right, so in the main demand in the first grade classroom, if you remember, you've got the first grade classroom at reading time, again, another one we use pretty frequently. You've got the boy who's passing out candy. If you remember, again, from our past sessions, you've got a hearing boy who's passing out candy, and the control decision of the interpreter is she gives him the I see you look. You've got the list of concurrent demands. Okay, so she looks over at him and gives him kind of the evil eye. What are the positive consequences? Is that she's addressed the behavior. Okay? Notice it doesn't say the kid puts the candy away. That would be a resolution, if you would. It's only just what the interpreter was going for. And what she was going for, or he was going for, was to address the behavior. The negative consequence is that the interpreter asserts herself into a position of authority. Now, the implied values that are either compelling or restraining her, the ones that are being deprioritized, in this example, laissez-faire, or letting people be themselves, self-determinacy, is the one that is being deprioritized. What's being prioritized in this moment is what you might, I guess, call professionalism. When you're in an environment where that's an expectation of the environment, perhaps working within that environment, perhaps we'd call that professionalism. Again, I think we have to call it something different. But for what we have right now, that's what I would call that. And just a couple more, and then I'll open up for questions. The main demand in the next example is the teacher uses facial expressions to correct hearing child's behavior. So imagine the teacher puts up her index finger to a hearing child to just signal him quietly about his behavior, and the interpreter actually signs something, and she may actually interpret, I need you to sit still. Okay, she interprets the gesture in a much more overt way. The positive consequence is that the visual gesture is connected to its meaning and made distinct from the story. Okay, because while the teacher is reading the story, she puts her finger up, could actually be confusing. But if that's actually made as a separate comment, then that distinction is made. Another positive consequence which comes from these concurrent demands is the deaf student's earlier correction is situated in the context of his classmate. In the concurrent demand, we say that the deaf student has engaged in a similar behavior. So if the deaf student is also squirming around, right, and the interpreter makes that fleshed out, then the deaf student is able to see that correction in context. The negative consequence is that additional information was relayed than what was said, and it's outside of the teacher's purview. And time and attention are taken away from the story. Okay, so what are the values that are being deprioritized here is fidelity, truthfulness, right? And but what's being valued here is accuracy, making sure that that there's clarity in the information. And the last example, the deaf student signs with one hand, and the interpreter chooses to use her closure skills and just uses consecutive interpreting. What is the positive consequence of doing that? The deaf student is able to maintain his current position and train of thought. The negative consequence is that there is a delay in a real-time response because she's waiting for his more information. And a precedent is established for the rules of the engagement of the interpreter. So perhaps the deaf student thinks that signing with one hand from here on out is going to be fine. So I would again suggest that accuracy is being deprioritized in this given decision, but laissez-faire, letting the child be who he is in the situation he is being prioritized. All right, I'm going to pause here now and see if anybody has any questions about pretty much anything at this point. All right, well, I'm not seeing anything, but if you are typing, don't worry, I will.
This is Amy. It seems like Robyn has dropped out, so we'll just give her a minute so she can get back in. It seems like Robyn's taking a little bit more time to come back in, so while we're waiting for her to join us, let me just go ahead and do some wrap-up things for us. Just as a reminder, today you can earn CEUs. For today, 0.15 professional study CEUs can be awarded for your participation today. If you're watching this webinar alone, once you X out of the system, a survey will come up, and by filling out that survey and providing your RID information, you will get CEUs for today. If you're watching it in a group, you can either individually do the satisfaction survey, or in the email that I sent out yesterday, there was a group sign-in sheet. Either way, you can submit a request to get CEUs. Please do fill out the satisfaction survey. We do listen to those, and we try our best to make sure that this event is exactly what you guys need and want. Robyn mentioned several times about a listserv that's been going on. There will be a continued listserv after today's webinar. It actually starts Monday. We bumped it up. Normally we wait about 4 weeks before we start the listserv, but due to the holidays we wanted to get the listserv in, so it will actually start Monday. The best thing that you can do if you want to participate is to email me, and I will add you to the listserv. Just with the tight turnaround and waiting for documentation and things like that, it'll be a lot easier if you can just email me and I'll add you to the listserv. You should have my email address because I'll emailed you. For the listserv, you can earn 1.0 CEUs for participation, and there are specific things that you'll need to do to meet that, and I will send out information pertaining to that. Our next webinar will be February 23rd. We're going back to a Thursday night at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. We will have a new presenter at that time that will continue on this theme. There are 3 more webinars related to the demand control schema and how it can be infused into curriculum for IEPs. And so our new presenter and Robyn will be coming back next year to finish up this topic. Registration for that webinar will open about 6 weeks before, and you will all get emails on that. Let me check and see where Robyn is at the moment. There does look to be 2 questions And what I will do if Robyn doesn't come back on before we end, I will email her these questions and then email the response and the questions out to everybody so that those can be answered. All right, it looks like we may have lost Robyn, but we trust that she is safe over in Scotland. Again, tonight, I just want to thank all of you guys for joining. I want to thank Robyn for presenting, our two interpreters, Kirk and Darlene, as well as our captionist, Carrie O'Brien, and also the members from the Clearinghouse, Jesse, Mike, and their team. Hold on, I'm just reading something. Oh, just another question. So that is all. I'll go ahead and let everybody go. Have a good rest of your Saturday and look for an email with these questions and responses. Have a good night, everybody.